Okay, so I was originally going to just go for doing the usual format I've been doing so far for the fazbear fright stories, but it seems to be taking me too long to get it done. So instead, I'm just going to do a quick fire run through all of the stories in one video and then see where they land on a timeline. So, Into the Pit establishes that in 1985 the missing children's incident occurs, and the story's protagonist Oswald notes that his dad was his age in that year, so at least 10 years old. So, fast forwarding, he would have been 18 in 1985, and so Oswald is 10 years old, so 10 years after that is 2005. However, it appears this story, based on certain details we get in the story, occurs around 2013. We know that To Be Beautiful occurs around 2 weeks before the events of the Stitch Reef Stingers, and so occurs in the October of the year that story is set in. Count the Ways shows us that Funtime Freddy is in disrepair and is basically scrap that has been collected at this point, and based on certain details in the story regarding YouTube videos about beauty, it can be inferred that this story takes place around 2014. Fetch takes place in the fall and appears to be occurring in the year prior to the Stitch Wraith saga's events. Lonely Freddy makes a point of noting during the story that the family has been going to the Freddy site for birthdays for at least the past 4 years, implying that this occurs before the franchise basically shuts down, and so this story appears to occur at some point around, at the latest, the early 2000s. We know based on the Stitch Ray Stingers that the events of Out of Stock occur within the events of the Stitch Wraith story, so they occur during the epilogue of the second book. 1:35 AM occurs in the springtime, and based on the fact that we see the Eridol in the Stitch Wraith Stingers having been salvaged by the Stitch Wraith, it can be inferred that this story at the latest occurs in the springtime of the year that those events take place. Room for One More appears to show us the beginnings of the Circus Baby Rentals site, and so the events that we see occurring here happen before Sister Location, and I'm believing that based on the fact that we know that Funtime Freddy is being salvaged at some point after 2014, so this story lands around 2015. The New Kid is a bit of an outlier among the stories and quite awkward when it comes to lore analysis, but as far as I can tell, it appears to occur around the start of springtime in the same year that the Stitch Wraith saga takes place, based on all of the events occurring around it. Based on the timeline and how it's working out and how things fall in line, Step Closer appears to take place after Freddy's has reopened thanks to VR, and appears to take place around August or September of the same year as the Stitch Wraith stories. Dance With Me shows us Circus Babies is an open establishment at the time of the story. We see some rather interesting glasses used as a plot device in the story, which 3D glasses were pretty popular in the 90s as a novelty item, and the fact that we have no reference to any form of modern technology within the story leads me to believe that the events in Dance With Me occur when the Circus Baby site from the fourth closet was active, and so they occur in 1997. Coming Home is basically farewell to Susie, one of the missing children, and so based on the available evidence regarding that incident, it would appear that the story of Coming Home takes place either in the fall of 1985 or 1986. Bunny Call is another one of those rather strange and hard to place ones, but I think I have found a solution. One of the major things that we see in this story is the protagonist looking at himself in a mirror. And then we find Phineas Taggart, out of all of his cursed items that he has recovered, has a mirror which witnesses a man kill his entire family. Now, based on the fact that we see Bob in Bunny Call fighting off what he believes to be Ralpho, which then leads to there being blood, which is not something we typically see with other remnant creatures. It tends to be like black goo, not blood. And each of these instances occurs when he is defending a family member, he believes. Then, in order for this to fall in line with the timeline somewhere, I think Bob is in fact the man who murdered his family and was hallucinating out of his mind, because as he is our protagonist character, he is an unreliable narrator as far as many of these stories go. We do tend to have certain details which they overlook because they don't know what we know. And so I'm going to say that Buddy Call falls in the summer of the year of the Stitch Wraith stories. In the Flesh is probably the worst out of all of the fazbear Fright stories, and as I have covered in a previous video, I believe that the only way for it to fit into the lore properly would be to make Matt the same Matt who knows Jeremy, and so that places this story after the events of the Prankster, which would imply that it falls somewhere after the creation of FNAF VR on the timeline. The man in room 1280 appears to be the origin of the Stitch Wraith Saga's events, as it sets up all of the cursed items and other stuff during the events of its story. And so we know that it occurs after Ultimate Custom Night, and it occurs in the fall, and I believe it occurs sometime not long before Fetch in the timeline, and so that is where the beginning of the next year's worth of events, where a lot of the fazbear Fright stories fall into. Blackbird was an unusual one during research, as at first I thought it occurred around the same time as the rest of the Stitch Wraith saga stories, but as we find in the Stitch Wraith Stingers, when Larson goes back through the remnant memories to the events of Blackbird, we see that the Freddy's site is in fact still active, which means this story occurs a lot earlier in the timeline than what I actually at first thought. And so that would mean, based on how Freddy's shut down most of its chains after the incidents, this story would take place around the early 2000s. The Real Jake gives us the origin story of the protagonist, basically, of the Stitch Wraith Stingers, and as we see, the events in the Real Jake occur in the summer, and it's believed this occurs not long before the events of the Stitch Wraith saga, so this would be the summer of that same year. Hide and Seek seems to fall into the same category as Blackbird, as we see that Freddy's related sites are still active at the time of this story. However, notably, it is in the franchisee era, which is what we kind of see Pizza Simulator emulating. However, that story appears to be a setup by whoever intended to burn the place down, which means that the propaganda and stuff that they were using was actually intended to be used years before. And so, based on the quirky, cheesy infomercial style that it has, this would have been the era when Freddy's was severely on the ropes prior to closing, which again places Hide and Seek somewhere around the early 2000s. The Cliffs gives us a tag-along Freddy, which is a small Freddy which is controlled via a watch by the parent to observe a child, And interestingly enough, this is what appears to be a smartwatch, which were invented in 2015. And so, based on the fact that this heavily resembles the fazwatch that we see in Security Breach, I would potentially place this story as occurring after the Stitch Wraith saga, as we have no indication that it is in any way connected with Remnant or anything to do with the Stitch Wraith saga. The Breaking Wheel, again, is a very odd story, as it has absolutely no recognisable ties to anything else in any of the other stories. However, the vast interest in robotics is something which I myself remember was quite a thing around the early 2000s, what with Cybots and Cyberpets and Furbies and whatnot, and so this may be a story that falls within that time frame as well. He Told Me Everything also appears to fall within the early 2000s time frame, as it utilises Freddy's Mad Science Kit, implying that the company was still around at the time of the story, even in a minimal capacity. And Mad Science Kits, again, are something that I fondly remember were part of childhood growing up in the early 2000s. And as we will come to see, a lot of these stories that fall into the early 2000s feature things that tend to be either body snatching or attempting to duplicate life forms in some way. Now, we know Gumdrop Angel occurs around April or May of whatever year it occurs in, and we know that at the time Freddy's sites are active. We also see that again we have a character who is in some way converted or body snatched by certain things from Freddy's, and as there is an active Freddy's site, it is possible that we can place this again into the early 2000s era. It could also be from when the Freddy's sites have reopened, but it is entirely unclear to us. Sergio's Lucky Day gives us an exact dating as far as any of these stories go, in that it occurs in 1995, as it is 10 years after he graduated in 1985. Interestingly enough, we see that at this time there is a remnant infected item, which many have taken to assume that that means that this story has to take place after the events of Room 1280, but that is not necessarily the case, as after infecting items with Remnant is not the only source of Remnant in the franchise, and it's entirely possible that the Remnant infecting Lucky Boy is in fact Andrew, and this is one of our earlier points of seeing him in the timeline, as my own official timeline headcanon for Andrew's existence is he is one of the kids from the second murder incident in FNAF 2. And so, as he points out, in the Stitch Wraith saga, he has been around in many items all over, and so this is literally his spirit jumping from place to place, and it has at this point found itself in the Lucky Boy toy, and then at some point passes on and in the future would come to be bound to Afton. What we found appears to literally be the events that occurred in the Fazbear Frights site, which inspired the FNAF 3 games events. And if you have watched my timeline video, then you will know that I believe this occurs around 2017. The Puppet Carver gives us a repeat character from another story. The Fazgoo appears to be back from the events of He Told Me Everything, and so this story occurs at some point after that one. And based on the fact that we have a knockoff Freddy's franchise with no mention of the original, would seem to indicate to me that this story falls between the closing of Freddy's and the rise of Circus Baby's rental, and so it occurs in the late 2000s. Jump for Tickets does appear to be an incredibly difficult one to place based on details within the story. It is commonly assumed that Coils the Clown is indeed the animatronic that would later go on to be innards as far as the mask is concerned. And so that, coupled with the fact that we know that the protagonist uses what appears to be a touchscreen phone, and also the fact that the Freddy's sites exist, would indicate that this story either takes place after Freddy's re-establishes itself as a franchise, or it occurs shortly before the fall of Freddy's as a franchise. And based on this fact, and the fact that there's a touchscreen phone, that would mean that at the latest, for the sites to have closed, this must take place around 2007, as that is when touchscreen phones became a thing that was actually widespread. Pizza Kit, again, is one of those kind of odd stories that doesn't really connect anywhere. However, we get reference to K-pop being popular within it, which was a thing that became prominent, especially in America, around 2019 or 2018, which would place this story long after Freddy's closed down, and so the tour of the Freddy's Pizza Factory would imply that these events occur after Freddy's makes a comeback from the popularity of FNAF VR. And so that would imply that since the company has been revamped, it is even offering tours of its pizza making facilities in order to encourage people to trust its brand once more. Now, Friendly Face starts in January and occurs over 9 months. Now, we don't get any confirmation of whereabouts in time this story takes place. However, we have TV adverts for Freddy Fazbear's, which may or may not have been an actual advert, and may have actually just been a targeted hallucination for the protagonist. Plus, the Freddy's facility sends out Robo-Pets with cloned human or even animal faces, which implies a high level of technical knowledge, meaning it seems very futuristic, so I'm inclined to place it after the events of the Stitch Wraith story, when Freddy's is back up and running. However, based on it being a Robo-Pet, and the fact that we have multiple cloning slash body swapping or biological experiments going on around the era of the early 2000s, it's possible it could be part of that time zone, but it's not entirely clear. Similarly, Sea Bonnies seems to fall into this time zone as well, as many who grew up in the late 90s or early 2000s will remember just how popular sea monkeys were back then as a novelty toy. And so, based on that and the fact that the protagonist wins them from the price counter of a Freddy Fazbear site, it would imply that this site has also not yet shut down, and so this story may in fact take place around the early 2000s. Now, Together Forever is an interesting one, as we see that there is not much mention of any level of modern technology in this story. The main characters are supposed to be popular girls at school, and yet there is not one mention of them using any kind of phone. So that immediately dates this story to being quite early on as far as technological development goes. We do have computers, but they've been around for literal decades before phones. And we find that when they go to the burger bar, there are radios playing and not TVs for some reason. So either this town is very low tech, or this takes place before the wide scale use of technology in society. That and the fact that the spring-lock suits are in use here, and they are discovered to have been recalled shortly after release, being a surprise to whoever was using them, it can be inferred that this story takes place sometime between the spring suits retiring, which would have been in the 80s, and the other end of that narrows down to around the 2000s. And so, at first, I kind of want to place this story in 2004, just because the popular girls really remind me of Mean Girls. So that is kind of like the furthest forward in time I want to place it at this time. Prankster appears to be events leading up to the events of FNAF VR's backstory involving Glitchtrap and Jeremy. And so this story falls just before that on the timeline. Kids at Play gives us yet another story where a protagonist is in some way body snatched or transformed by an item from Freddy's. This time it appears to be a toy from a box of cereal, and again this is strongly reminiscent of the early 2000s or late 90s. Based on the events that we see in the story, this does seem to correlate with that, as I don't believe there's any other reference to modern technology again in this story. And so we see that this era in the timeline has some kind of strange mad science things going on. Now, Find Player 2 appears to be the last story in what is considered the actual fazbear Frights stories, and so we find that this story actually has events that occur over 10 years, and we can infer from the facts given that the first year in this point of this story is around 1997, as there are mentions of things such as capri pants, which were pretty popular in the late 90s, and in the modern time part of the story, the protagonist is specifically noted to drive a hybrid car, which is implied to be very fancy and quite new, and this would place this around 2007, as this is when in America hybrids became an actual thing. So we see that the Freddy site that she visits out of state is active in 1997, and by 2007 it is no longer a Freddy's site. Now, the stories from the 12th book in the Fazbear Frights story are implied to just be reject stories and not be canon, but if that were the case, why publish them? And also, there is evidence to support them being in some capacity canon to the main storyline, as we see in the Stitch Wraith Stingers. So, Felix the Shark appears to occur after the downfalls of Freddy's, and not much is given in terms of dating for this story, but it can be implied that it occurs at least after the events of FNAF 3. The Scoop features locations which appear to exist in the Stitch Wraith Saga's Remnant Memories, and the fact that there is a purple man villain, who in fact may actually be the Remnant infused entity, seem to imply that this story does in fact occur in the timeline, and so it appears to fall around sometime between FNAF 3 and Room 1280, but we don't get any other confirmation besides that, other than the fact that this exists in the era where Freddy's is a legend and has multiple fan-based speculations upon it. So this is before FNAF VR launches, to redo the brand's name. Now, if we're placing this story after FNAF 3, we know that the incident that occurs within this story occurred 17 years ago, which would make it land at some point in the early 2000s. And so the entity, which appears as a Dark Shadow, has been very, very active in that time period. And finally, You're the Band. We see that Mike is a security guard for a Freddy's facility and appears to be investigating it in some way, and tracks down a missing Freddy head which seems to possess the kid who holds it. It is sent to them by an unknown entity who sold it on eBay, and we find that the puppet exists in an old Freddy site which Mike guards. We never really get to see if the site is actually active or whether he's guarding an abandoned building at this point, but you see the shadowy entity is active and is trying to get to the mask which the family has in order to extract the remnant, presumably, and we find that the Freddy sites all closed a long time ago due to an incident that occurred there. So, with the incident occurring around 30 years ago, as is stated in the story, if this is meant to be the missing children incident in 1985, then that would place this story around 2015, and that would seem to make sense, but this is the last kind of point in the timeline before all the animatronics end up getting put into the Fazbear Frights facility. And so as we can see, the 1985 incident occurs, and then shortly after, Susie shows us exactly how spirits linger and are drawn to the remnant agony. Going forward, we know that spring suits are retired shortly after they were created, and then that places us the next story together forever. Then Sergio's Lucky Day, which shows us that what appears to be some form of spirit or remnant infests Lucky Boy, and this is far before any of the other stories in the timeline, so the remnant that is present in Lucky Boy is clearly not from the Afton incident in room 1280. And as we see, Lucky Boy appears to resemble Balloon Boy, who resembles Zor from Ultimate Custom Night, and so it's possible that the spirit in Lucky Boy is actually the vengeful spirit of Andrew, who I believe dies in 1987 in FNAF 2. Friendly Face also occurs around this time, as if we presume that the school which is mentioned in this story, which has the damp problem, is also the same school that was flooded that was mentioned in Together Forever. If we also assume that the woman who works for Fazbear's, who is involved in this story that sends out the abomination cat, is indeed Circus Baby, then that would place us after she was released from Henry's secret room under his house, meaning that this story takes place around 1997 at the earliest. And we can infer that also Dance With Me occurs in 1997 due to the links with the Circus Baby's site that we see, being the only one that we know of that was ever open for any length of time, and also the events of Find Player 2 that occur in the past with the disappearance of Amy's friend are also occurring in this year, albeit in the Pacific Northwest region. And so by 1998, FNAF 1 occurs, and it's possible that around this time the Crying Child has moved to the Pacific Northwest area, and this would make sense if we assume that the bite occurs in 1987, and then the child covers at some point during the 90s, and there is even a child named Evan, if we assume that is his name based on evidence that's been given so far. Then Evan was in the school in Together Forever. And so we see in the early 2000s that Circus Baby was around harvesting agony, as well as at this time we noticed that the franchise of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza would be going into a severe decline, and that several knockoff franchises also existed around this time. It is speculative, but it does appear that this is the time period where Circus Baby began her experiments, where certain creations within Freddy's establishments were made with what appears to be the goal of either snatching another person's body or transferring an entity into it. This would include experiments involving cybernetics as well as genetic experimentation, creating such things as the Lonely Freddies, Sea Bonnies, the Gumdrop Nose, and the Fazgoo scene in He Told Me Everything, which would later go on to become a sentient being which is loose in the world. We can presume at this point that Jump for Tickets explains to us how the Freddy's facility's safety precautions became majorly scrutinised around this time, and the franchise would begin to move towards a more franchisee approach, as we have seen in FNAF 6. Now, at some point, I believe in the early 2000s, Freddy's does actually close down as a facility, as we find out in Sister Location. This would then lead on to the rise of the Rentals facility as a franchise. And so this is the era that we see many of the Freddy's facilities become rebranded as other things, such as the Player 2 site becoming the Cow Milkshake place, or Jeff's Pizza for the original Freddy's site. And then we also see that some of the animatronics have just been taken completely out of circulation and are basically found in junkyards and whatnot, such as in Count the Ways. And also we see that Room for One More shows us that around this time, the rental company, whoever runs this, is still to this day never been fully explained, but whoever they are begins to gather up and collect all of these animatronics together, implying it may actually be Mike, but given what happens in this location, this seems unlikely. And so for the majority of the 2010s, we see that Freddy's has been reduced to urban legends, which eventually develops its own game series, which then we see in the Scoop is an actual thing in world, and also FNAF 3 occurs around 2017, and we see that Hudson is the inspiration in these books behind the FNAF 3 games events. And presumably not long after FNAF 3, FNAF 6 occurs, which then traps Afton with the Vengeful Spirit in Ultimate Custom Night. After what is still never been concluded, but we can infer is some amount of years later, Afton is released from his entrapment by the spirit and corrupts several items which are sent out into the world. One of these items ends up in the Pacific Northwest region, and it's the Fetch animatronic, and it would later end up being returned to the man Phineas Taggart. Now, my only explanation so far for the new character seems to be that Kelsey, for whatever reason, might actually be the Fazbear creature, because he does bleed when he's put into the Springlock suit, but he also gets out of it. But the Fazbear entity does seem to have weird relations to its own memories and whatnot, so it's possible that it doesn't even know that it is in fact a creature anymore, like it just absorbs the personality of other beings that it mimics, and so it just continuously goes from friend group to friend group, finding new people to impose its justice upon. And it's possible due to the remnant memories that we see in Larson's fight with Circus Baby, this creature is in some way being driven by Circus Baby as a pawn of some kind. Now, a child named Jake would die in the summertime, and given the available evidence, it's possible that this could in fact be the son of Evan, who is the son of William Afton, making him somewhat more tied to the actual lore of the story. And this kid goes on to possess an animatronic, which is also possessed by the vengeful spirit Andrew. And interestingly enough, this is when all the remnant items start to be collected in by Phineas Taggart, leading to Circus Baby and Afton gaining more power. As Jake inadvertently collects all of the remnant items together, which is exactly what Baby wanted, Afton, not realising this, is defeated when Detective Larson, who is investigating the Stitch Reef entity, finds them and brings the puppet salvaged from the FNAF 6 fire and uses it to destroy Afton's amalgamation body. Circus Baby, however, continues to escape justice and runs off again. Now, also around this time is when FNAF VR launches, and several digital VR games are also in production in relation to the Freddy's franchise, including the one in the Flesh. Now, eventually, Circus Baby is defeated by Jake and Larson. However, it is never conclusively proven that she is completely destroyed and so can return. And then from here, Larson keeps the pendant, which acts like an illusion disc, which she was using to disguise herself, which ominously rings at the end of the story. Jake enters the ball pit in order to provide happy memories to all the deceased souls and potentially himself. So if he does not ascend at this point to basically no longer exist, then it's possible he is also still out there somewhere in the world. And also we find that the Freddy Fazbear's franchise has been renewed, having regained its reputation after the success of the VR game, and so the special delivery service has been in use throughout the time of the Stitch Reef stories, and now Freddy's is moving on to create the Pizzaplex that we see in Security Breach.